Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. The New York Times seems to be reducing their carbon footprint by recycling old news. This is the front page of the New York Times today. All the news that's fit to print. They're blaming the retreat of Swiss glaciers on the burning of fossil fuels. It's good climate fear porn, except that the New York Times reported the same thing in 1930. December 21st, 1930. Word comes from Switzerland that the alpine glaciers are in full retreat. Out of 102 glaciers observed, more than two-thirds have been found to be shrinking, while palms, cypresses, magnolias, myrtles, and olive trees thrive at the feet of the Adirondacks as they did in those distant days. 1930 was also the worst year for forest fires in the United States, with burn acreage more than 10 times higher than this year. In 1930 brought record heat to the United States, with Delaware, Kentucky, Mississippi, and Tennessee setting their all-time temperature records. Now let's go back to 1922. There was a radical change in climatic conditions in the Arctic, with unheard-of high temperatures and glaciers disappearing. In 1902, Swiss glaciers were disappearing. Hotel keepers in the Swiss Alps having new trouble and are complaining at the loss of patrons. The attractive glaciers are said to be actually passing from the landscape. The famous glaciers of the Rhone have shrunk several thousand feet in the last 20 years, considerably more than 100 feet per year. Between 1905 and 1907, the Great Rhone Glacier of Switzerland lost 88,250 square feet. In 1911, there was grave news about the glaciers of Switzerland. All of the glaciers were disappearing in Switzerland during the coldest years of Michael Mann's hockey stick. According to Michael Mann, 1911 was right at the end of 900 years of northern hemisphere cooling. So if the glaciers were melting during the coldest years of the millennium, when did they form? According to the 1990 report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, during the Little Ice Age, there were extensive glacial advances in almost all regions of the world between 150 and 450 years ago. That was during the Little Ice Age, which was reported by the IPCC in 1990. But by 2001, they had erased the Little Ice Age. Having erased the Little Ice Age, the IPCC no longer had a coherent story for when the glaciers formed. The 1990 IPCC report made sense, but the 2001 report made no sense at all. In 1939, it was reported by the leading Arctic expert that the glaciers of Norway and Greenland were facing the possibility of a catastrophic collapse because they were melting very quickly. Dr. Ullman documented the retreat between 1869, 1933, and 1946. So once again, according to Michael Mann's hockey stick, we have glaciers retreating during the coldest years of the last millennium. But by 1963, the glaciers of Norway were growing for the first time in 200 years. So it must have been very cold around 1963. In 1961, the New York Times reported unanimous agreement among scientists that Earth was getting colder. In 1974, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration reported that the Northern Hemisphere had cooled about half a degree centigrade since 1940. But Michael Mann has almost completely erased that cooling which occurred after 1940, and now shows glaciers growing during a time when it was much warmer than when the glaciers were retreating. Once again, this graph makes no sense. Now let's compare Michael Mann's graph to Keith Briffa's temperature reconstruction and to the 1974 graph of the National Center for Atmospheric Research. Both of these graphs showed about half a degree Celsius cooling after the 1940s. Unlike Michael Mann's graph, Keith Briffa's temperature reconstruction made sense. He showed glaciers melting when it was warm, and he showed glaciers growing when it's cold, which is what every scientist should understand. But the global cooling which occurred after 1940 was politically inconvenient, so Michael Mann erased it. He hid the decline. Michael Mann has opinions on a lot of different things. He says that the vast majority of the United States is a scourge upon the earth that must be destroyed. He says that all of these red areas of the United States are rotten and evil to their core. According to Michael Mann, 83% of U.S. counties are pure evil. And for pushing his insanity on a wide range of topics, including climate, he's been handsomely rewarded with $5 million in assets. In the 2001 report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they chose to use Michael Mann's nonsensical and utterly ridiculous hockey stick graph instead of Keith Briffa's accurate temperature reconstruction, which once again shows that the core mission of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is politics, not science. The New York Times is just propaganda and has been for a long time. But they expose the tip of the iceberg underlying the much larger problem in climate academia. Toto has been playing back the curtain on the climate scam for almost 16 years. You can visit him and his family on the web at realclimatescience.com.